The wind howled across the Montana plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bite of early winter and the promise of harder days ahead. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, blanketing the vast wilderness in a silence so complete it seemed to press against a man's eardrums. Through this white curtain of isolation, Luke Garrison stood at the window of his weathered cabin, watching the storm swallow up what little remained of the day. At 32, Luke had the build of a man who'd spent his life wrestling with the land. Broad shoulders, calloused hands, and a face weathered by sun and wind. His dark hair had begun to show threads of silver at the temples, though he'd never taken a wife to notice such things. He lived alone on the ranch his father had carved from the wilderness, tending cattle and horses with the same quiet determination that had kept the Garrison name on this patch of earth for nearly 2 decades. The cabin itself was a testament to solitary living, functional but sparse, with rough-hewn furniture built for durability rather than comfort. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold now as Luke conserved his dwindling supply of cut wood. The storm had been raging for 3 days, and he'd begun to ration everything from firewood to the last of his smoked venison. Luke was considering whether to brave the wind and fetch more wood from the barn when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Hoofbeats, muffled by snow but growing closer. He pressed his face to the frosted glass, squinting through the swirling white until shapes began to emerge from the storm. A horse, near collapse, carrying what looked like a woman and children. Luke grabbed his coat and rifle, not from any sense of threat but from years of prairie caution, and stepped out onto his covered porch. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving snow into his eyes. "Hello!" he called out, his voice nearly lost in the gale. "This way!" The horse stumbled toward him, and as it drew nearer, Luke felt his heart perform a strange dance in his chest. Even through the snow and exhaustion, even after more than 15 years, he recognized her. Emily Crawford, though she'd carried different names since then. The girl who'd run barefoot through the wheat fields of his childhood, who'd helped him build dams in the creek behind the schoolhouse, who'd kissed him once behind the church when they were both 14, a kiss that had haunted him through years of loneliness. She slumped in the saddle, her dark hair plastered to her head by melting snow, her clothes torn and inadequate for the brutal weather. Behind her, clinging to her waist, were 2 small figures bundled in threadbare blankets. At the horse's heels trotted a thin mongrel dog, its coat matted and eyes wild with exhaustion. "Emily?" Luke's voice cracked like a boy's. She raised her head at the sound of her name, and their eyes met across the years. Hers were the same cornflower blue he remembered, but now they held depths of pain that made his chest ache. She tried to speak, but only a whisper emerged, lost in the wind. Luke didn't hesitate. He waded through the knee-deep snow and reached for the horse's bridle. "Come on, old girl," he murmured to the exhausted mare. "Let's get you all inside." The horse needed no encouragement to follow him toward the small barn attached to the cabin, once inside the relative shelter. Luke helped Emily down from the saddle. She nearly collapsed in his arms, her body trembling with cold and exhaustion. The 2 children, twin girls, he realized, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, huddled together, watching him with wide, frightened eyes. "Let me help," Luke said gently, lifting one of the girls while Emily managed the other. The dog limped along behind them, its tail tucked low but not quite defeated. Inside the cabin, Luke quickly stirred the coals in the fireplace and added kindling. The flames caught and began to push back the cold that had crept into the room. He fetched blankets from his bed, all of them, leaving none for himself, and wrapped the small family by the fire. Emily finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a rasp. "Luke, I didn't know where else." "Don't talk yet," he said, moving to the kitchen area. "Let me get something warm into you." He heated water and prepared the last of his good coffee, adding a generous dollop of honey. While it brewed, he sliced the remaining venison and heated it in a skillet with some of the potatoes he'd been saving. The smell filled the cabin. and he noticed the children's eyes following his every movement. When he brought the food to them, the twins fell upon it with the desperate hunger of children who hadn't eaten properly in days. Emily ate more slowly, her hands shaking as she held the tin cup of coffee. "Thank you," she whispered. Luke settled into his father's old chair across from them, studying her face in the firelight. She was still beautiful, perhaps more so than the girl he remembered, but there was a brittleness to her now, a wariness in her eyes that spoke of hard lessons learned. "How did you find me?" he asked gently. "I remembered your father's letters," she said, not meeting his eyes. "After he died, I heard you'd stayed on the ranch." Luke nodded. His father had corresponded with Emily's family occasionally, before they'd moved away from their small Kansas town. "That was 10 years ago." "I know." She pulled one of the girls closer, smoothing the child's tangled hair. "I know it's been a long time." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions. Finally, Luke asked the one that had been burning in his throat since he'd first seen her. "Where is he? Emily? Your husband?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Emily's face went pale, and she looked down at her hands. The twins had fallen asleep against her, their small bodies finally warm and fed. The dog had curled up near the hearth, its watchful eyes moving between Luke and the door. Emily began, then stopped. Her fingers found the edge of her sleeve, pulling it down to cover what Luke now noticed were dark marks around her wrist, bruises in various stages of healing. "Emily?" She met his eyes then, and in them he saw such a mixture of fear, shame, and desperate hope that it nearly broke his heart. "He's gone," she whispered finally. I can't." One of the twins stirred in her sleep and murmured, "Mama, are we safe now?" Emily's composure cracked. A single tear traced down her cheek as she stroked her daughter's hair. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe." Luke felt something shift inside his chest, a protective instinct he'd never known he possessed. Whatever had happened, whatever had driven Emily into the storm with 2 small children, he knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't let her face it alone. "You don't have to explain anything tonight," he said quietly. "You're safe here, all of you." The other twin opened her eyes, green like her mother's had been before sorrow deepened their color to blue, and looked directly at Luke with the startling directness of children. "Are you our new papa?" she asked sleepily. The words hit Luke like a physical blow. He felt heat rise to his face and looked helplessly at Emily, who had gone very still. "Hush, Sarah," Emily whispered. "Go back to sleep." But the child's innocent question lingered in the air between them, carrying with it the weight of possibilities and the echo of dreams Luke had buried long ago. Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside the cabin, by the light of the fire, something was beginning that would change all their lives forever. Emily pulled both children closer and closed her eyes, and for the first time in what looked like months, her face relaxed into something approaching peace. Luke sat watching over them as the night deepened, already knowing that whatever had brought her back to him, he would never let her go again. Dawn came slowly to the Montana wilderness, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pearl and rose. Luke had spent most of the night in his father's chair, dozing fitfully while keeping watch over his unexpected guests. The storm had finally blown itself out sometime before sunrise, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow and crystalline silence. Emily stirred first, her eyes fluttering open to find Luke's gaze upon her. For a moment, confusion clouded her features. Then memory returned, and with it, a mixture of relief and embarrassment that colored her pale cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, careful not to wake the twins who still slept curled against her. "We imposed on you terribly." "Don't apologize," Luke said, rising stiffly from the chair. His back ached from the uncomfortable position, but he'd endured far worse nights. "You needed help. That's what neighbors do." The word neighbors felt inadequate for what lay between them, but Luke didn't know what else to call the connection that had sparked to life the moment he'd recognized her through the storm. Emily seemed to understand, nodding as she gently extracted herself from the sleeping children. "Let me help with breakfast," she offered, but Luke shook his head. "You rest. I'll manage." He moved to the kitchen area, acutely aware of her eyes following his movements. The cabin felt different with her presence in it, smaller somehow, but also more alive than it had been in years. He prepared coffee and heated leftover venison, trying to ignore the way his hands trembled slightly as he worked. "Luke?" Emily's voice was soft but carried an undertone he couldn't quite identify. "The girls, their names are Sarah and Margaret. Sarah's the one who spoke to you last night." "Margaret and Sarah," Luke repeated, glancing at the sleeping twins. They were identical in feature, but he was already beginning to notice small differences. Sarah seemed bolder, more direct, while Margaret appeared quieter, more observant. "They're beautiful. Emily, they look like you did at that age." A shadow passed across Emily's face. "They look like their father, too. Sometimes it's difficult." Luke paused in his coffee preparation, sensing deeper waters beneath her words. The bruises on her wrists told part of a story he was beginning to piece together, but he held his questions back. There would be time for truth later, when she was ready. The twins began to stir as the smell of food filled the cabin. Margaret opened her eyes first, blinking in confusion at the unfamiliar surroundings before memory returned. She sat up carefully, studying Luke with the serious expression of a child who had learned early to be wary of strangers. Sarah, true to her more assertive nature, bounded to her feet and marched directly to Luke. "I'm hungry," she announced, "and I need to use the necessary—" Luke couldn't help but smile at her directness. "The outhouse is behind the cabin, but let me get you bundled up first. It's mighty cold out there." While Luke helped the girls into their inadequate coats, Emily busied herself tidying the blankets. He noticed how she moved carefully, favoring her left side, and the way she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through it at any moment. After breakfast, Luke suggested a tour of the property. "Might do you all good to get some fresh air," he said. "And I need to check on the livestock." Emily hesitated. "We don't want to be in your way." "You're not in my way," Luke said firmly. "Besides, the girls should know their way around if they're going to be staying here for a while." The assumption in his words hung in the air between them. Emily's eyes widened slightly, and Luke felt heat creep up his neck. He hadn't meant to presume, but something deep in his chest rebelled at the thought of her leaving again. "I mean, if you want to stay," he added awkwardly. "Until you figure out what comes next." Emily's expression softened. "We'd like that very much." The morning air was sharp and clean, making their breath visible in small puffs as they made their way to the barn. The twins marveled at everything, the way their footsteps squeaked in the snow, the ice formations hanging from the barn eaves, the warm breath of the horses in their stalls. Luke's small herd had weathered the storm well, huddled together in the shelter he'd built for them. As he forked hay into their feeding troughs, he found himself acutely aware of Emily's presence beside him. She moved with unconscious grace despite her obvious fatigue, and when she reached out to stroke the nose of his gentlest mare, "Bella," the horse responded immediately to her touch. "You always were good with animals," Luke observed. Emily smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since her arrival. "Mama used to say I had a gift. I'd forgotten. Some gifts don't leave you, even when you forget them for a while." Their eyes met over Bella's neck, and Luke felt that familiar flutter in his chest. Emily looked away first, but not before he caught a glimpse of something that might have been longing in her expression. The twins had discovered the barn cat, a battle-scarred Tom named Gideon, who typically avoided human contact. To Luke's amazement, the cat allowed both girls to pet him, even purring when Sarah scratched behind his ears. "He likes us," Margaret said, speaking for the first time since the previous night. Her voice was softer than her sister's, but carried the same underlying strength. "Animals know good people when they meet them," Luke replied, earning another shy smile from the quiet twin. They spent the morning working together, Luke chopping wood while Emily and the girls gathered kindling. The physical activity seemed to ease some of the tension that had been coiled in Emily's shoulders, and Luke found himself stealing glances at her as she worked. She looked more like the girl he remembered now, with color in her cheeks and purpose in her movements. When they returned to the cabin for the midday meal, Luke noticed that Emily had begun to relax in small ways. She hummed softly while preparing biscuits from his meager flour stores. And when Sarah spilled milk on herself, Emily's laugh was genuine and unguarded. But it was during the quiet afternoon, while the twins napped and they sat together mending his worn work shirts, that the careful walls Emily had built around herself began to crack. "I never learned to sew properly," she admitted, holding up her clumsy stitches. "Mama tried to teach me, but I was always more interested in climbing trees and catching frogs." "I remember," Luke said softly. "You climbed higher than any of the boys. Made us all jealous." Emily's needle stilled. "That feels like someone else's life now. It doesn't have to." Luke reached across the small space between their chairs and gently touched her hand. "That girl is still in there. Emily, I can see her." She looked up at him, tears gathering in her eyes. "So much has happened. Luke, I've done things, made choices. We all have." He replied firmly, "But that doesn't change who you are at heart." The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with possibility. Luke became acutely aware of everything: the soft sound of Emily's breathing, the way afternoon light caught the gold threads in her brown hair, the warmth of her skin beneath his fingers. Emily seemed to lean toward him, her lips parting slightly, and Luke felt his heart begin to race. He dreamed of this moment more times than he could count, imagined what it would be like to kiss her properly, as a man rather than the boy he'd been all those years ago. But then Margaret stirred in her sleep, murmuring something inaudible, and the spell was broken. Emily pulled back, her cheeks flushed, and returned her attention to her sewing with determined focus. "The girls," she whispered. "They've been through so much. I have to be careful." "I understand," Luke said, though disappointment sat heavy in his chest. "They come first." Emily nodded gratefully, but he noticed that she didn't move her hand away from where his still rested near hers on the small table between them. As evening approached, they prepared supper together in comfortable companionship. Emily proved surprisingly adept at stretching their limited supplies into a satisfying meal, and Luke found himself watching the efficient way she moved around his kitchen as if she belonged there. The twins chattered through dinner, their earlier wariness giving way to childish excitement about their new surroundings. Sarah peppered Luke with questions about everything from why horses needed shoes to whether wolves really lived in the forest. Margaret listened quietly but intently, occasionally asking more thoughtful questions that revealed a sharp mind behind her reserved exterior. "Do you live here all by yourself?" Sarah asked around a mouthful of biscuit. "I do," Luke replied. "Have for about 10 years now, since my father passed." "Don't you get lonely?" Margaret's question was barely above a whisper. Luke glanced at Emily, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I've got the animals for company, and now I've got you three." After dinner, they gathered around the fireplace again. Luke played simple games with the twins while Emily darned socks, the domestic scene filling something hollow in his chest that he hadn't even realized was empty. When the girls finally succumbed to sleep, curled together on the makeshift bed he'd arranged near the fire, Emily and Luke found themselves alone again. "They trust you," Emily observed quietly. That's not something that comes easily to them anymore." "What about you?" Luke asked gently. "Do you trust me?" Emily was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "I'm trying to remember how—" Luke felt his heart break a little at the honesty in her words. Without thinking, he reached for her hand again, relieved when she didn't pull away. "You don't have to remember all at once," he said. We've got time. Emily's fingers tightened around his, and when she looked up at him, he saw a glimmer of the girl he'd once known. Brave, determined, and beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with appearance. "Thank you," she whispered. "For taking us in, for not asking questions, for being you." Luke squeezed her hand gently. "There's nowhere else I'd rather you be." 3 weeks had passed since Emily's arrival, and the rigid isolation of Luke's bachelor existence had given way to something he'd never dared imagine: the warmth of family life. The twins had settled into routines that revolved around morning chores, afternoon lessons by the fire, and evening stories that stretched long into the night. Emily had transformed his sparse cabin into something approaching a home, with wildflowers dried and arranged in mason jars, curtains sewn from spare fabric, and the constant presence of laughter and conversation. But the outside world had begun to take notice. Luke first sensed trouble during his weekly trip to Mercy's Bend, the small settlement 20 miles south that served as the region's trading post and social center, where once the townspeople had greeted him with the casual familiarity reserved for reliable customers. Now he encountered whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached, and sideways glances that followed him through Murphy's general store. "That's quite a lot of supplies you're buying there, Luke," observed Mrs. Henley, the storekeeper's wife, as she tallied his purchases of flour, sugar, and cloth. "Planning to do some entertaining? Just stocking up for winter," Luke replied evenly, though he could feel heat creeping up his neck. He'd always been a private man, but now that privacy felt more like a shield protecting something precious. "Winter's still months off," commented Jeremiah Cartwright from his position near the pickle barrel. Cartwright owned the largest spread in the county and considered himself an unofficial authority on local affairs. "Course, I hear you've got extra mouths to feed these days." The words were casual enough, but something in Cartwright's tone made Luke's jaw tighten. News travels fast in a small place. "That it does." Cartwright's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Especially when it's news about a woman and 2 young ones showing up out of nowhere. Makes folks curious about things like where her husband might be." The question hung in the air like smoke from a poorly ventilated chimney. Luke felt every eye in the store upon him, waiting for his response, his hands resting on the counter, clenched involuntarily. "I wouldn't know anything about that," he said finally. "Wouldn't you?" This came from Tom Bradley, a man whose own reputation had been tarnished by excessive drinking and loose talk. "Seems mighty convenient, a pretty woman turning up at a bachelor's door in the middle of a storm. Almost like she was running from something, or someone. Or maybe," Bradley continued, emboldened by the attention, "she wasn't running at all. Maybe she knew exactly where she was headed. Maybe her husband's been taken care of already, if you catch my meaning." The implication hit Luke like a physical blow. His vision went red around the edges, and he found himself taking a step toward Bradley before Mrs. Henley's sharp voice cut through his anger. "That's quite enough speculation for one day. Tom Bradley, take your gossip somewhere else." Bradley shrugged, unrepentant. "Just saying what others are thinking. Woman shows up alone with children, claims to be widowed but won't say how or when. Makes a man wonder." Luke forced himself to complete his purchases without another word, but Bradley's insinuations followed him all the way home. By the time he reached the cabin, his mood was as dark as the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Emily took one look at his face and sent the twins outside to play with strict instructions not to wander far. The dog, sensing tension, positioned himself protectively near the girls. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Luke set the supplies on the kitchen table with more force than necessary. "Talk, the kind that spreads like wildfire in small towns." Emily's face went pale. "About us, about you, about where you came from, about—" Luke struggled to find a way to voice Bradley's ugly implications without causing Emily more pain. "About your husband." Emily sank into a chair as if her legs had suddenly lost the ability to support her. "What are they saying?" "Does it matter?" Luke asked. more harshly than he'd intended. "They don't know anything. They're just— It matters to me." Emily's voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. "Please, Luke, I need to know what I'm facing." So he told her, watching as each word seemed to hit her like a physical blow. When he finished, Emily was silent for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "They think I killed him," she whispered finally. "They think I'm a murderer." "Emily, no, they think you helped me hide the body." The words hung between them like a chasm. Luke felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized the precarious position they were both in a place where justice was often swift and informal. Suspicion could quickly become conviction. What really happened? Emily? The question had been burning in him for weeks, and now it spilled out before he could stop it. "I need to know. If we're going to face this together, I need to know the truth." Emily looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw fear, shame, and something that might have been relief. "You want to know if I killed my husband?" It wasn't a question. Luke felt his heart skip a beat at her directness. "I want to know what happened," he said carefully. "All of it." For a moment, he thought she might refuse. Then Emily drew a shaky breath and began to speak, her voice so low he had to strain to hear her. "His name was Frank Morrison. I married him when I was 17, after Papa died and left us with nothing. Frank seemed safe, steady. He had a small farm in Kansas, and he promised to take care of Mama and me." Her laugh was bitter. "For a while, he did, but after Mama passed, he changed, started drinking more, started saying things about how I looked at other men, how I couldn't be trusted." Luke felt anger building in his chest, but he remained silent. "When I told him I was carrying twins, he accused me of being unfaithful, said no woman in his family had ever had twins, so they couldn't be his." Emily's voice broke slightly. "He started hitting me then, not where it would show, but enough to make his point." Luke's hands clenched into fists. The urge to find Frank Morrison and settle accounts was so strong it made him dizzy. After the girls were born, it got worse. He'd look at them sometimes like he hated them, said they were proof of my shame. One night, when they were crying— Emily stopped, wrapping her arms around herself as if she were cold. "Emily," Luke said gently, "you don't have to. He hit Sarah." The words came out in a rush. "She was barely 2 years old, and she was crying because she was hungry, and he backhanded her so hard she flew across the room." Luke felt something murderous rise in his chest. "Jesus." I grabbed both girls and ran. We lived in the woods for 3 days before he found us. When he dragged us back, Emily touched her throat unconsciously, and Luke noticed faint scars he'd never seen before. He said next time, he'd make sure I couldn't run. "Where is he now?" Luke's voice was rough with barely controlled emotion. Emily met his eyes directly. "Dead." The single word seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the cabin. Outside, Luke could hear the twins laughing as they played, the sound incongruous with the darkness of Emily's revelation. "How?" "I don't know." Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "One morning I woke up and he was gone. His horse was still in the barn, his clothes still in the house. It was like he just vanished." "People don't just vanish. Emily." "I know." Tears were streaming down her face now. "I searched everywhere, asked neighbors, went to the sheriff. Nothing. It was like he'd never existed." Luke studied her face, looking for signs of deception and finding none. But there was something in her expression, a flicker of knowledge she wasn't sharing. "Emily," he said carefully, "are you telling me everything?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was so low he barely caught the words. "I prayed he was dead, every night for months. I prayed God would take him before he could hurt us again." She looked up at Luke with eyes full of anguish. "What kind of woman does that make me?" Before the Luke could answer, the cabin door burst open and both twins tumbled inside, cheeks flushed from play and eyes bright with excitement. "Luke," Sarah announced breathlessly. "There's a man coming up the road." Luke was at the window in 3 strides. In the distance, a lone rider was approaching at an easy pace, even from far away. There was something familiar about the man's posture that made Luke's stomach clench. "Emily," he said urgently. "Take the girls into the back room, now!" But Emily had already seen the rider, and the blood had drained completely from her face. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Oh, God, it's him!" "Who?" Luke demanded, though he already suspected. "Frank's brother, Daniel Morrison." Emily's voice was hollow with terror. "If he's here, it means—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Luke understood. Daniel Morrison's presence meant that Emily's secret was about to be dragged into the light, whether she was ready or not. The twins sensed the sudden tension and moved instinctively closer to their mother. Emily gathered them against her, but her eyes never left the approaching rider. "What do we do?" she whispered. Luke reached for his rifle, checking to ensure it was loaded. "We face it," he said grimly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." But even as he spoke the words, Luke felt the first cold fingers of doubt creeping into his heart. Emily had sworn her husband was dead, but she'd also admitted to gaps in her knowledge about his disappearance, and now his brother had tracked her across 3 states to Luke's isolated ranch. The questions that had been simmering beneath the surface of their newfound happiness suddenly demanded answers. What exactly had happened to Frank Morrison? How much did Emily really know? And what would Daniel Morrison's arrival mean for all of them? Outside, the rider drew steadily closer, bringing with him the weight of the past and the promise of reckoning. Daniel Morrison was a harder, leaner version of the man Emily had described as her husband, where Frank had apparently run to fat and drink. Daniel carried himself with the wiry strength of someone accustomed to violence. His pale eyes swept over Luke's property with calculating interest before settling on the cabin where Luke stood framed in the doorway, rifle held casually but ready. "You, Luke Garrison?" Daniel's voice carried the flat twang of eastern Kansas, and there was something in his tone that immediately put Luke on edge. "I am—" "What's your business here?" Daniel swung down from his horse with practiced ease, his hand resting meaningfully on the grip of his sidearm. "Looking for my brother's wife. Heard she might be in these parts." Luke kept his expression neutral despite the hammering of his heart. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Emily Morrison. Pretty little thing. Dark hair, blue eyes. Got herself 2 young daughters." Daniel's smile was thin and predatory. "Sound familiar?" "Can't say it does." "Funny thing," Daniel continued, tying his horse to Luke's hitching post with deliberate slowness. "Folks in town seem to think otherwise. Lady at the general store mentioned you'd been buying supplies for a family. Extra flour, children's clothes, women's things." Luke felt ice forming in his stomach. He'd underestimated how closely the townspeople had been watching his purchases. "Man's got a right to prepare for winter however he sees fit." Daniel chuckled, but there was no warmth in the sound. "Winter's still months off, friend. But I suppose a man gets lonely out here all by himself. Might be tempted to take in strays, if you know what I mean." The implication in Daniel's words made Luke's grip tighten on his rifle. Through the cabin's single window, he could see Emily pressing herself against the wall, the twins clutched protectively behind her. "I think you'd better move along," Luke said quietly. "You're not welcome here." Now. Daniel held up his hands in mock surrender. "No need for hostility. I'm just looking for family. My brother Frank went missing about 6 months ago, and his wife and children disappeared around the same time. Strange coincidence, don't you think? Don't know anything about any missing persons. Course you don't." Daniel's eyes never left Luke's face. "But here's the thing. Emily's got a talent for making men disappear. First her father died real convenient-like when she needed an excuse to marry up. Then Frank vanishes right after he started asking questions about those twins of hers." Luke felt his blood turn to fire. "You're talking nonsense." "Am I? See, Frank wrote me letters. Told me all about his suspicions. How Emily couldn't explain why she'd birthed twins when no one in either family ever had multiples. How she'd look at other men when she thought he wasn't watching. How she'd whisper to those girls in a way that made him think they were keeping secrets. "You're describing a man who was sick in the head," Luke said coldly. "Maybe your brother's disappearance was a blessing." Daniel's face darkened. "Careful, Garrison, that's family you're talking about. And what would you call a man who beats his wife and children?" The words hung between them like a challenge. Daniel's hand moved closer to his gun, and Luke shifted his rifle to a more ready position. "So she has told you stories," Daniel said softly. "Probably painted Frank as some kind of monster. That's Emily's way. She's got a gift for making men believe whatever she wants them to believe. What I believe is that you're trespassing on my property." Actually, Daniel's smile returned. "I'm conducting an investigation. See, I've been asking questions all over Kansas. Turns out Emily left town real sudden like the night Frank disappeared. Packed up those girls and ran like the devil was chasing her. Now why would an innocent woman do that?" Luke felt the first cracks forming in his certainty. Emily had admitted to praying for her husband's death, but she'd maintained she didn't know what had actually happened to him. What if there was more to the story? "Maybe she was scared," Luke said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had held moments before. "Of what? A missing man?" Daniel shook his head. "No, friend. She ran because she knew something. Question is, did she do it herself? Or did she have help?" The accusation hit Luke like a physical blow. "If you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything. Just observing that Emily's got a history of attracting men willing to do her dirty work. And look here, she shows up on your doorstep in the middle of winter, helpless and needy. And suddenly you're buying supplies for a family and pointing rifles at law-abiding citizens who ask uncomfortable questions. You're not law-abiding anything. You're just a man with a grievance and a gun." Actually, Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "I'm a man with a warrant." Luke's heart sank as he recognized the official seal. Daniel unfolded the document with theatrical precision. "Warrant for the arrest of one Emily Morrison. Wanted for questioning in the disappearance of Franklin Morrison. Signed by Judge Carruthers in Dodge City." Daniel's smile was triumphant. "Seems I'm not the only one who thinks Emily's got questions to answer." From inside the cabin came a sound that might have been a sob. Luke felt the world shifting beneath his feet, all his certainties crumbling like sand. "Even if that's legitimate," Luke said desperately, "she's got children to think about. You can't just drag her back to Kansas." "Oh, but I can, and I will." Daniel folded the warrant and returned it to his pocket. "Course, if she's got nothing to hide, she'll come willing. Innocent folks generally do." Luke's mind raced, trying to find some way out of the trap that was closing around them. "The children will be just fine. I'll see they get to Frank's sister in Missouri. She's been wanting to take them in, give them a proper Christian upbringing." Daniel's expression hardened, away from whatever influence Emily's been poisoning them with. The thought of Sarah and Margaret being torn away from their mother made Luke sick. He'd seen how the twins clung to Emily, how they still startled at loud noises and unexpected movements. Being separated from the only parent they had left would destroy them. "I won't let you take them," Luke said quietly. "You won't let me," Daniel laughed. "Friend, you're in no position to let or not let anything. You're harboring a fugitive and interfering with the law. Keep pushing, and you'll find yourself in chains right alongside her." Luke felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. If he continued to resist, he'd likely end up dead or imprisoned. And Emily and the twins would be defenseless. But if he stepped aside, the cabin door opened slowly, and Emily emerged with the twins pressed close against her sides. She looked pale, but composed, her chin lifted in defiance despite the fear Luke could see in her eyes. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I wondered when you'd find me." "Emily." Daniel's voice carried a mixture of satisfaction and something darker. "You're looking well for a woman whose husband mysteriously vanished." "I've told everyone who asked. I don't know what happened to Frank." "Is that so?" Daniel's pale eyes glittered with malice. "Because I've been doing some digging. Emily, talking to neighbors, checking with the sheriff. Funny thing, seems like Frank wasn't the only one asking questions about those twins of yours. Emily went very still. What do you mean? Old Doc Hensley in Clearwater. Remember him? He delivered the girls. Daniel's smile was cruel. Had some interesting things to say about the timing. Seems Frank was away on business for near 3 months before you quickened with child. Makes a man wonder. The color drained completely from Emily's face. Luke felt understanding dawn with horrible clarity. The twins weren't Frank's children. That's why the man had been so suspicious, so violent. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it explained the depths of his rage. "That doesn't mean anything," Emily whispered, but her voice shook. "Doesn't it? See, I think Frank figured it out. I think he confronted you, and I think you did something about it." Daniel stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Question is, did you kill him yourself, or did your lover do it for you?" "Stop it!" Sarah suddenly burst out, pulling away from her mother to stand protectively in front of her. "You leave Mama alone." Daniel looked down at the little girl with something approaching pity. "Poor child. Don't even know what kind of woman birthed you." "I know exactly what kind of woman she is," Luke said firmly, finding his voice again. "She's brave and kind, and a better parent than Frank Morrison ever was." "Touching," Daniel said dryly. "But sentiment doesn't change facts. Emily's coming back to Kansas to face questioning. Tonight." "No." Emily's voice was steady now, resolute. "I won't go. I won't leave my children." "You don't have a choice." "Everyone has choices," Luke said quietly. He looked at Emily, seeing the woman he'd fallen in love with all over again. Not perfect, perhaps, but strong and desperate and doing everything she could to protect her children. "Emily, tell me the truth. All of it. Whatever happened. We'll face it together." Emily looked at him for a long moment, tears gathering in her eyes. Then she turned to Daniel, her expression hardening. "You want the truth? Fine. Frank didn't disappear mysteriously. He's dead, and I'm glad he's dead." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "He beat me. He terrorized my children, and he was getting worse every day. So yes, I prayed for his death, and when it happened, I ran. I ran because I knew men like you would never believe that a woman like me could be innocent of anything." "So you admit it," Daniel said triumphantly. "I admit to being grateful to be free of him. Nothing more." Luke felt something settle in his chest. Not certainty, exactly, but a kind of peace. Whatever Emily had or hadn't done, she'd done it to protect herself and her children. That was enough for him. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said quietly. Daniel's hand moved to his gun. "You prepared to die for her, Garrison?" Luke thought of Sarah's direct questions and Margaret's shy smiles. He thought of Emily's gentle hands mending his shirts and the way she hummed while she worked. He thought of the family they'd begun to build in the quiet weeks since her arrival. "If it comes to that," he said simply. For a moment, the three adults stood frozen in tableau, the weight of violence hanging heavy in the air between them. Then Margaret tugged on Emily's skirt. "Mama," she whispered, "I'm scared." The simple words broke the spell. Emily knelt and gathered both twins into her arms, and Luke saw Daniel's expression flicker with something that might have been doubt. "This isn't over," Daniel said finally. "I'll be back with the sheriff and enough men to drag you both to justice." He mounted his horse with quick, angry movements. "You've got until tomorrow to think about your choices. Emily, come willing, or come in chains. Either way, you're coming." As Daniel rode away into the gathering dusk, Luke felt the enormity of their situation settling over him like a shroud. Tomorrow would bring reckoning, one way or another. But tonight, they were still together, still a family, and that would have to be enough. The hours after Daniel Morrison's departure passed like a waking nightmare. Emily sat by the window, watching the horizon for any sign of returning riders, while the twins played quietly in the corner. Sensing the tension that filled the cabin like smoke, Luke paced the small space like a caged wolf, his mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to disaster. "I have to go," Emily said suddenly. breaking the oppressive silence. "If I stay, they'll arrest you too. The girls will lose both of us." "No." Luke's voice was firm. "Running didn't work before. It won't work now." "Then what do you suggest?" Emily's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Wait here for the sheriff to come with chains. Let them drag me back to Kansas to hang for something I didn't do." Luke stopped pacing and looked at her directly. "Did you kill him? Emily, your husband, did you kill Frank Morrison?" The question hung between them like a blade. Emily met his gaze steadily, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know." The words hit Luke like a physical blow. "What do you mean you don't know?" Emily wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold the pieces of her sanity together. "The night he disappeared, it was the worst beating he'd ever given me. He'd been drinking for days, accusing me of terrible things, saying he was going to get rid of the girls, send them to an orphanage where they couldn't shame him anymore." Luke felt his hands clench into fists, but he remained silent. "He had me by the throat." Emily continued, her voice hollow with memory. "I couldn't breathe. The girls were screaming, and I knew he was going to kill me that time, so I fought back." "How?" "There was a fire poker beside the hearth. I grabbed it and—" Emily's voice broke. "I hit him, hard. He let go of me and stumbled backward, cursing. Then he just walked out into the night. I never saw him again." Luke studied her face, looking for signs of deception and finding none. Only the haunted look of someone who had lived with unbearable uncertainty for months. "That's not murder, Emily. That's self-defense." "Is it?" Emily's laugh was bitter. "Tell that to a jury of men who think a wife should submit to her husband no matter what he does to her. Tell that to Daniel Morrison, who's convinced I'm a killer." Luke knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his. They were cold as ice, despite the warmth of the cabin. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "If Frank Morrison died that night, it wasn't your fault, but we need to know what really happened. We need proof. How can we get proof of something that happened 6 months ago in Kansas?" Luke was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then an idea began to form, desperate and dangerous. But their only chance, the body. He said slowly, "If Frank is dead, his body is somewhere. Daniel Morrison can waive warrants and make accusations. But without a body, there's no proof of murder." Emily stared at him. "You want to go back to Kansas? Luke, that's madness. Even if Frank is there, how would that help? They'll just say I killed him and hid the evidence." "Not if the evidence tells a different story." Luke's mind was racing now, the plan taking shape. "You said he walked out into the night after you hit him, drunk, injured, in the middle of winter. If he died, it could have been from exposure, from falling, from any number of accidents. The condition of the remains might tell us something. And if you're caught, if Daniel Morrison is watching the old place—" Luke stood, his decision made. "Then at least we'll have tried. Emily, I can't stand by and watch them destroy you for defending yourself. I won't." Emily rose as well, reaching out to touch his face with trembling fingers. "Why are you doing this? Why are you risking everything for me?" Luke covered her hand with his own. "Because I love you. I've loved you since we were children, and I'll love you until the day I die. Whatever you've done, whatever you haven't done, it doesn't change that." Tears spilled freely down Emily's cheeks now. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I always have. But Luke, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm choosing." Luke turned to look at the twins, who had stopped playing and were watching the adults with wide, frightened eyes. "Sarah, Margaret, come here." The girls approached cautiously. Luke knelt to their level, his expression serious but gentle. "I need to go away for a few days," he said carefully, "to take care of some grown-up business. While I'm gone, you need to take care of your mama and watch over the ranch. Can you do that for me?" Sarah, ever the bold one, stepped forward. "Are you going to fight the bad man?" "I'm going to try to fix things so the bad man can't hurt your mama anymore." Margaret, quieter but just as perceptive, asked. "What if you don't come back?" The question pierced Luke's heart. He looked into her solemn green eyes and made her a promise he prayed he could keep. "I will come back. No matter what happens, I will find a way back to you and your mama and Sarah. Do you believe me?" Margaret studied his face with the intensity of a much older person. "Finally." She nodded. "I believe you." Luke spent the rest of the evening preparing for the journey. He packed light, food for several days, ammunition for his rifle, and a small shovel that might prove useful. As he worked, Emily watched him with an expression that mixed love with terror. "How will you even know where to look?" she asked as he checked his gear one final time. Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then she went to the small bag that contained her few possessions and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "I drew this," she said, handing it to him. After that night, I was so scared, so confused. I kept thinking I should go back and look for him, make sure he was, but I was too frightened. So I drew everything I could remember instead." Luke unfolded the paper and found himself looking at a remarkably detailed map. Emily had sketched the layout of their old homestead, marking the house, the barn, the well, and various landmarks. A dotted line showed the path Frank had taken when he stumbled out into the night. "He headed toward the old creek bed," Emily explained, pointing to a wavy line on the map. "There's a ravine there, maybe 20 feet deep. When we were first married, Frank used to say it was dangerous, that a man could fall in and break his neck if he wasn't careful." Luke studied the map, committing every detail to memory. "This is good, Emily. This gives me somewhere to start." As dawn approached, Luke made his final preparations. He saddled his strongest horse, loaded his supplies, and kissed Emily and the twins goodbye. The farewell was almost unbearable. He could see in Emily's eyes the fear that she might never see him again, and the twins clung to him with desperate intensity. "Remember," he told Emily as he prepared to mount, "if anyone comes asking questions, you don't know where I've gone. I'm just out checking the far pastures. Due back any day." Emily nodded, though they both knew the deception would only work for so long. Luke rode hard for the first day, pushing his horse across the Montana wilderness toward the Kansas border. The journey would take him nearly a week if he rode carefully, less if he was willing to risk his mount's health. Given the urgency of the situation, he chose speed over caution. As he traveled, Luke found himself thinking not just about the task ahead, but about the strange turns his life had taken. A month ago, he'd been a lonely bachelor with no prospects beyond tending his cattle and waiting for winter. Now he was racing across hostile territory to find evidence that might save the woman he loved from the gallows. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was risking his life for someone who might, in fact, be guilty of the crime she was accused of. But as the miles passed beneath his horse's hooves, Luke found that it didn't matter. Emily had defended herself and her children against a man who had terrorized them. Whether Frank Morrison had died from the blow she'd struck or from his own drunken stumbling afterwards seemed like a distinction without moral difference. On the third day, Luke encountered his first real danger. He'd stopped to water his horse at a small stream when he spotted riders in the distance, 3 men moving with the purposeful direction of a search party. Luke quickly led his horse into a stand of cottonwoods and waited, heart pounding. As the riders passed within 50 yards of his hiding spot, he recognized one of them, a deputy from Mercy's Bend named Collins, a man known for his dedication to duty and his inflexible interpretation of the law. If Collins was this far from home, it meant the sheriff had already been contacted and a formal search was underway. Luke waited until the riders were well out of sight before continuing, but the encounter sobered him. Time was running shorter than he'd hoped. If Emily was right about the location, if Frank Morrison's body was where she thought it might be, Luke had perhaps 2 days to find it and return with evidence before Emily was arrested. The old Morrison homestead appeared on the horizon just as the sun was setting on the 4th day. Luke approached cautiously, watching for signs of occupation or surveillance. The house stood empty and partially boarded up, with weeds growing tall in what had once been Emily's garden. It looked like a place where hope had died. Luke made camp in a grove of trees nearly a mile from the house, not daring to risk a fire. He spent a restless night listening to the sounds of the prairie and thinking about Emily and the twins, wondering if they were safe, if Daniel Morrison had kept his word about waiting. At first light, Luke began his search of the ravine Emily had marked on her map. The creek bed was dry this time of year, making it easier to navigate, but the sides of the ravine were steep and treacherous. Luke moved carefully, examining every shadow, every depression, every place where a man's body might have come to rest. It was late afternoon when he found what he was looking for. The skeleton lay wedged between two fallen logs at the bottom of the ravine, partially covered by 6 months' worth of debris. Luke's heart pounded as he carefully cleared away the accumulated leaves and branches, revealing bones that were unmistakably human and unmistakably adult male. More importantly, the skull showed a clear fracture on the left side, consistent with Emily's story of striking her husband with the fire poker. But there were other injuries as well: a badly broken leg, ribs that showed signs of impact, and positioning that suggested the man had fallen a considerable distance. Luke sat back on his heels, studying the scene with growing excitement. The evidence told a clear story. Frank Morrison had left his house injured and drunk, had fallen into the ravine, and had died from a combination of his injuries and exposure. Emily's blow might have contributed to his death, but it hadn't been the sole cause. As Luke carefully documented everything he could see, making notes and rough sketches, he heard the sound that had been haunting his nightmares for days: hoofbeats, multiple riders, approaching fast. Luke looked up to see 3 men on horseback at the rim of the ravine above him. Daniel Morrison sat in the center, flanked by 2 men wearing deputies' badges. All 3 had their guns drawn. "Well, well," Daniel called down. "Luke Garrison, I presume, come to visit an old friend." Luke slowly stood, his hands carefully visible and empty, just doing a little exploring. "Is that what you call it?" Daniel's smile was cold with triumph. "Looks more like tampering with evidence to me. Boys, I think we've got ourselves another fugitive." As the deputies began their careful descent into the ravine, Luke realized that his desperate gamble had failed. He'd found the evidence that could clear Emily, but he might not live to present it, and without his testimony, Emily and the twins would face Daniel Morrison's vengeance with no one to protect them. The thought of their fate filled Luke with a desperation that bordered on fury. Whatever happened next, he would find a way to get word back to Emily about what he'd discovered. The truth about Frank Morrison's death was finally known. Now, Luke had to find a way to survive long enough to share it. The Clearwater County Courthouse was a modest building of rough-hewn timber and good intentions. But on this gray October morning, it seemed to loom over the assembled crowd like a monument to judgment. News of the Morrison case had spread across 3 counties, drawing spectators from as far as Dodge City to witness what the newspapers had dubbed the widow's trial. Luke sat in the front row, his wrists still bearing rope burns from his capture at the ravine. Daniel Morrison had brought him back to Montana in chains, but Sheriff Hawkins, a fair man despite his stern demeanor, had released him after hearing his account of finding Frank Morrison's remains. The physical evidence Luke had documented told a story that contradicted Daniel's accusations of premeditated murder. Emily sat at the defendant's table beside James Whitmore, the young attorney the town had appointed to represent her. She wore a simple gray dress that someone, Luke suspected Mrs. Murphy from the general store, had altered to fit her. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and she kept her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. She had not looked at Luke since entering the courtroom, but he could see the tension in every line of her body. The twins sat with Mrs. Abernathy, the minister's wife, who had volunteered to care for them during the proceedings. Sarah fidgeted constantly, her young mind unable to grasp why her mother was being kept from them. Margaret sat perfectly still, her green eyes fixed on Emily with an intensity that broke Luke's heart. Judge Cornelius Thorne called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. He was a man in his 60s, weathered by frontier justice but known for his fairness. His gray eyes swept the packed courtroom before settling on the defendant. "The territory versus Emily Morrison," he announced. "The defendant is charged with the murder of her husband, Franklin Morrison." "How does the defendant plead?" Emily rose slowly, her voice clear despite her obvious fear. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The prosecution was handled by District Attorney William Cross, a man whose ambition was matched only by his theatrical flair. He began his opening statement by painting Emily as a calculating woman who had trapped Frank Morrison into marriage and then murdered him when he discovered her infidelity. "Gentlemen of the jury," Cross declared, gesturing dramatically toward Emily, "you will hear testimony that this woman bore children who could not possibly have been her husband's when Frank Morrison confronted her about her adultery. She struck him down in cold blood and disposed of his body to cover her crime." Luke felt his jaw clench as Cross continued his character assassination, describing Emily as a seductress who had manipulated innocent men into helping her escape justice. When Cross mentioned Luke by name, suggesting he was Emily's latest victim, Luke had to resist the urge to stand and defend her honor. Whitmore's opening statement was quieter but no less compelling. He spoke of a young woman trapped in an abusive marriage, fighting for her life and the lives of her children against a man who had become increasingly violent and unstable. "The evidence will show," Whitmore said, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom, "that Emily Morrison acted in self-defense against a man who had threatened to kill her and harm her innocent children. What happened to Frank Morrison was a tragedy, but it was not murder." The first day of testimony belonged largely to the prosecution. Daniel Morrison took the stand to describe his brother as a good man driven to desperation by his wife's betrayal. He spoke of Frank's letters detailing his suspicions about the twins' parentage and Emily's alleged affairs. "Frank was a God-fearing man," Daniel testified, his voice heavy with manufactured sorrow. "He loved those children like his own, even when he began to suspect they weren't. But Emily," she twisted his love into something ugly. Under cross-examination, Whitmore managed to expose some of the inconsistencies in Daniel's account. If Frank had truly loved the children, why had neighbors reported hearing screams from the Morrison house? If Emily was so manipulative, why had she lived as a virtual prisoner in her own home? "Isn't it true, Mr. Morrison," Whitmore pressed, "that your brother had a reputation for violence even before his marriage, that he was known to settle disputes with his fists?" Daniel's composure cracked slightly. "Frank could be firm when necessary. A man has to maintain order in his household." "By firm, do you mean striking his wife? Threatening his children?" "I never saw any evidence of that," Daniel replied, but his eyes avoided the jury. The second day brought more damaging testimony. Dr. Hensley, the physician who had delivered the twins, confirmed under oath that the timing of Emily's pregnancy made Frank's paternity questionable. Several neighbors testified to arguments they had overheard, though none would admit to witnessing actual violence. Luke watched Emily's face grow paler with each witness. The portrait being painted was of a woman who had been unfaithful to her husband and had killed him to avoid exposure. The fact that she had fled immediately after Frank's disappearance only seemed to confirm her guilt in the minds of many spectators. But then came the moment Luke had been waiting for. Whitmore called him to the stand. Luke placed his hand on the worn Bible and swore to tell the truth, his eyes finding Emily's for the first time since the trial began. She looked at him with a mixture of hope and terror that nearly undid his composure. "Mr. Garrison," Whitmore began, "please tell the court how you came to know the defendant." Luke spoke clearly, describing his childhood friendship with Emily and her unexpected arrival at his ranch. He told of her obvious injuries, the twins' fearful behavior, and his growing understanding that Emily had been living in terror. "When I found Frank Morrison's remains," Luke continued, "I made careful note of their condition and position. The evidence suggested that Mr. Morrison had fallen into the ravine while intoxicated and died from his injuries and exposure to the elements." Cross's cross-examination was brutal. He suggested that Luke was besotted with Emily and would say anything to protect her. He questioned Luke's qualifications to determine cause of death and implied that Luke himself might have been involved in Frank's murder. "Isn't it true, Mr. Garrison, that you were in love with the defendant when you were both children?" Luke felt heat rise to his face. "I cared for her, yes. And when she arrived at your ranch as a fugitive from justice, those old feelings returned, didn't they? She wasn't a fugitive. She was a woman seeking safety. Safety from what? From facing justice for her crimes." Luke's composure finally broke. Safety from being killed by a man who beat her and terrorized her children. Safety from the kind of justice that blames a woman for defending herself. Judge Thorne's gavel cracked like thunder. "Mr. Garrison, you will confine yourself to answering the questions asked." But Luke's outburst had an effect. Several jurors were looking at him with something approaching respect, and he could see doubt creeping into their expressions. The most dramatic moment came when Emily herself took the stand on the third day. Whitmore questioned her gently, allowing her to tell her story in her own words. She spoke of her marriage to Frank, initially happy but gradually becoming a prison of fear and violence. "He changed after my mother died," Emily testified, her voice barely above a whisper. "He became suspicious, jealous. He accused me of looking at other men, of improper behavior. When I told him I was with child, he said terrible things." "What did he say about the children?" Emily's hands trembled in her lap. "He said they couldn't be his, that I had shamed him. As they grew, he would look at them with such hatred. Did he ever strike you, Mrs. Morrison?" "Yes." The word came out as barely a breath. "Did he ever strike the children?" Emily's composure broke, and she began to weep. "He hit Sarah once. She was crying because she was hungry, and he knocked her across the room. That's when I knew I had to get them away from him." The courtroom was absolutely silent as Emily described the night of Frank's disappearance. Her testimony matched Luke's account of the evidence. Frank had been drinking heavily, had become violent, and Emily had defended herself with the fire poker. "I hit him once," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He let go of my throat and staggered backward, cursing at me. Then he walked out into the night. I never saw him again." Cross's cross-examination was merciless. He accused Emily of lying, of inventing the abuse to cover her crime, of using her tears to manipulate the jury. But Emily held to her story, answering each question with quiet dignity despite her obvious distress. The closing arguments came on the fourth day. Cross painted Emily as a calculating murderess who deserved to hang for her crimes. Whitmore spoke of justice tempered with mercy, of a woman who had endured years of abuse and had finally fought back in desperation. Frank Morrison's death was a tragedy, Whitmore concluded. But it was not murder. Emily Morrison struck one blow to defend her life and the lives of her children. What happened afterward was an accident, a drunken man stumbling into a ravine in the darkness. To convict this woman of murder would be to say that wives have no right to defend themselves against violent husbands, that mothers have no right to protect their children from harm. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Luke paced the courthouse steps, smoking cigarette after cigarette despite never having been much of a smoker. Emily remained in the courthouse with her attorney, too anxious to leave even for fresh air. When the jury finally returned, Judge Thorne called the court to order. The foreman, a weathered rancher named McKinnon, stood to deliver the verdict. "On the charge of murder in the first degree," McKinnon announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "we find the defendant not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Emily collapsed into her chair, sobbing with relief. Luke felt his knees go weak with gratitude. But the celebration was short-lived. Daniel Morrison was on his feet, shouting about justice denied in corrupt juries. "This isn't over," he yelled as the bailiff escorted him from the courtroom. "She's a killer, and everyone knows it." Judge Thorne's gavel restored order. "Mrs. Morrison," he said formally, "you are free to go. This court is adjourned." As the crowd began to disperse, an elderly woman Luke didn't recognize made her way to Emily's side. She was small and bent with age. but her eyes were sharp and kind. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, taking Emily's hands in her own. "My name is Agnes Carmichael. I wanted you to know. I lived through what you lived through. For 30 years, I endured what you endured, but I never had the courage to fight back." The woman's voice grew stronger. "You saved yourself and your children. Don't let anyone make you feel shame for that." Other women began to approach, some to offer support, others simply to touch Emily's hand in solidarity. Luke realized that the trial had done more than determine Emily's legal fate. It had given voice to experiences that many women had suffered in silence. As the courthouse emptied, Luke finally reached Emily's side. She looked up at him with eyes that were red from weeping, but clear of the fear that had haunted them for so long. "It's over," she whispered. Luke gathered her into his arms, not caring who might see. "It's over," he agreed. "You're free." Outside, they could hear Daniel Morrison still shouting threats, but his voice was growing distant. The twins broke free from Mrs. Abernathy and ran to their mother, who knelt to embrace them both. "Are we going home now?" Sarah asked. Emily looked at Luke over her daughters' heads. Home. It was a word that had meant pain and fear for so long. But as she saw the love and acceptance in Luke's eyes, she realized it could mean something different now. "Yes," she said softly. "We're going home." The journey back to the ranch felt like a passage between worlds, where the trip to Clearwater had been marked by tension and uncertainty. The return was suffused with a quiet peace that seemed to settle deeper into their bones with each mile. Emily rode beside Luke, the twins secured safely behind them on gentle horses borrowed from Sheriff Hawkins. The October sky stretched endlessly blue above them, and for the first time in months, Emily found herself able to appreciate its beauty without fear. "Look, Mama!" Sarah called out, pointing to a hawk circling high overhead. "He's free like us." Emily smiled at her daughter's words, feeling the truth of them resonate in her chest. Free? It was a concept she was still learning to embrace, like a language she had once spoken fluently but had forgotten through years of disuse. When the familiar outline of Luke's cabin came into view across the rolling grassland, Emily felt something shift inside her, a recognition that went deeper than mere relief. This was home now, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this was where she chose to be. Luke helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist longer than strictly necessary. There was something different in his touch now, a certainty that had replaced the careful restraint he had shown before the trial. The ordeal they had endured together had burned away pretense, leaving only honest feeling. "Welcome home," he said quietly, and Emily heard in those simple words a promise of belonging. The twins ran ahead to greet Gideon, the barn cat, who had apparently missed their attention during their absence. The dog they had brought with them in the storm, now called Rusty for his red-brown coat, emerged from the barn where Luke had left him in the care of his neighbor. The reunion was joyful, with Rusty dancing around the girls and barking his excitement. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Emily marveled at how natural it all felt. The girls chattered about their adventure, turning the frightening trial into a grand story where their mother was the brave heroine and Luke was the knight who saved the day. Luke listened with patient amusement, occasionally catching Emily's eye across the table with a look that made her pulse quicken. Later, after the twins had been tucked into their beds and the cabin had settled into evening quiet, Emily and Luke found themselves alone by the fire. The silence between them was charged with possibility, heavy with words that had been waiting to be spoken. Emily worked at her mending, trying to keep her hands busy while her mind raced. Luke sat across from her, whittling a piece of wood that was slowly taking the shape of a horse, a toy for the girls. She realized the domesticity of the scene was both comforting and somehow electrifying. "Luke," she said finally, setting down her needlework, "I need to ask you something." He looked up, his knife pausing in its work. "Anything. Why did you do it? Risk everything for me and the girls? You could have been killed or imprisoned Or... Her voice trailed off as she struggled to find words for all the terrible possibilities that might have befallen him. Luke set down his whittling and studied her face in the firelight. "Do you really not know?" Emily felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I know you said, that is, you mentioned feelings, but I love you, Emily." His voice was steady. "Sure. I've loved you since we were children playing by that old creek, when you disappeared from my life. I told myself I'd forgotten, but I never did, and when you came back..." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "When you came back, it was like waking up from a long sleep." Emily felt tears prick at her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "But Luke, I'm not the same girl you remember. I'm damaged, used. I come with so much complication." "Stop." Luke rose from his chair and knelt beside hers, taking her hands in his own. "You are not damaged. You are strong and brave and beautiful. What you've survived doesn't diminish you. It proves how extraordinary you are." Emily searched his face, looking for signs of doubt or pity and finding none, only love, steady and unwavering. "I don't know how to be with a man who doesn't hurt me," she admitted, the words coming out in a rush. "I don't know how to trust that gentleness will last." Luke's thumb traced across her knuckles, the touch feather-light. "Then let me show you. We have time, Emily, all the time in the world." She leaned forward until their foreheads touched, breathing in the scent of him, wood smoke and leather and something indefinably masculine that made her feel safe. "The girls," she whispered. "They've been through so much. I can't do anything that might upset them or make them feel uncertain. The girls love you, and they're starting to love me too. We'll make this work. Emily, we'll build something good together." Emily pulled back to look at him directly. "Are you asking me to marry you, Luke Garrison?" A slow smile spread across his face. "I suppose I am, though I should probably do it properly." He started to rise, but Emily caught his hand. "This is proper enough for me." She leaned forward and kissed him, softly at first, then with growing confidence as she felt his response. It was nothing like the kisses she had endured in her marriage. This was gentle and asking rather than demanding, an invitation rather than a conquest. When they broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily. "Is that a yes?" Luke asked, his voice rough with emotion. "That's a yes," Emily confirmed, then laughed at the expression of wonder that crossed his face. "Did you think I would refuse you after all this?" "I hoped," Luke said simply, but hoping and knowing are different things. They talked long into the night, making plans and sharing dreams. Luke spoke of expanding the ranch, maybe raising horses as well as cattle. Emily talked tentatively about the garden she would plant in the spring, the improvements she could make to the cabin. They were small dreams, domestic dreams, but they felt revolutionary to a woman who had spent years simply hoping to survive each day. As the fire burned lower, the conversation turned more intimate. Luke told her about the years of loneliness, the way he had measured every woman he met against the memory of a girl with cornflower blue eyes. Emily spoke of her marriage, the gradual erosion of hope, the way she had protected her heart by pretending it didn't exist. "I want you to know," Emily said carefully, "that that is, what I had with Frank wasn't love. It wasn't even affection. Really, just duty and fear." Luke's jaw tightened at the mention of her dead husband. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. But I do want to tell you. I need you to understand that what I feel for you is completely different. You make me remember what it's like to want to be touched." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Luke reached out to cup her face in his palm, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Emily," he said quietly, "I need you to know that I don't have experience with..." He stopped, color rising in his cheeks. Emily stared at him as understanding dawned. "You mean you've never been with a woman?" Luke nodded, looking simultaneously embarrassed and defiant. "I know that probably seems strange for a man my age, But I never found anyone I wanted to. And after you left, I guess I was always comparing everyone else to the memory of you. Emily felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Here was this good, strong man, offering her not just his love, but his innocence as well. The gift of it, the trust it represented, nearly overwhelmed her. "That's not strange," she whispered. That's beautiful." She stood and held out her hand to him. "Come with me." Luke rose slowly, his eyes questioning. Emily led him toward the bedroom, pausing at the doorway to look back at him. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I'm certain." Emily replied, "For the first time in years, I know exactly what I want." What followed was a revelation for both of them. Luke's inexperience was more than compensated for by his patience and tenderness, his obvious reverence for Emily's body and her pleasure. For Emily, it was an awakening, the discovery that physical love could be gentle and mutual, that her own desires mattered and were worthy of attention. They moved together slowly, carefully, learning each other's rhythms and responses. When Emily gasped with unexpected pleasure, Luke's wonder was so genuine that she laughed with delight. When he finally joined with her completely, the moment was so tender and right that Emily wept with the beauty of it. Afterward, they lay entwined in the narrow bed, Emily's head on Luke's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never knew," Luke whispered into her hair. "I never understood what all the fuss was about." Emily smiled against his skin. "And now I think I could spend the rest of my life trying to make you feel the way you just did." "Just the way I felt?" Emily teased, trailing her fingers across his chest. "What about how you felt?" Luke's arm tightened around her. "Like I was finally home. Like everything that happened before was just waiting for this moment." They talked in whispers until dawn, sharing secrets and dreams, sealing their commitment with gentle touches and soft kisses. When the first light began to creep through the small window, Emily rose to check on the twins, pulling on Luke's shirt to cover herself. The girls were sleeping peacefully. Sarah sprawled across her half of the bed while Margaret curled in a tight ball. Emily stood watching them for a long moment, marveling at how secure they looked. How different from the frightened children who had arrived in the storm weeks ago. When she returned to the bedroom, Luke was sitting up, his hair tousled and his chest bare in the morning light. The sight of him made Emily's newly awakened body respond with interest. "They're sleeping soundly," she reported, moving back toward the bed. Luke's eyes followed her movement with obvious appreciation. "Good," he said, reaching for her. "Because I'm not nearly done with you yet." Emily laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to fill the small room with sunshine. As Luke pulled her back down beside him, she realized that for the first time in her adult life, she was exactly where she wanted to be, with exactly the person she wanted to be with. The nightmares of her past were finally behind her. The future, whatever it might bring, would be faced together, and this moment, this perfect, precious moment, was theirs alone. Outside, the Montana dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, promising a day full of possibility. Inside the little cabin, two hearts that had found their way back to each other celebrated the beginning of a love that would last a lifetime. Spring came early to the Montana territory that year, painting the rolling hills in shades of green that seemed to promise endless possibilities. The harsh winter that had brought Emily and her daughters to Luke's door felt like a distant memory now, replaced by the gentle warmth of renewal and growth. Emily stood in the doorway of the expanded cabin, watching Luke work with the twins in what had once been a barren patch of earth behind the house. Together, they were building raised beds for the vegetable garden she had dreamed of through the long winter months. Sarah knelt beside Luke, her small hands struggling to hold a board steady while he hammered, her tongue poking out in concentration. Margaret sat nearby, carefully sorting seeds they had ordered from the catalog. Beans, carrots, squash, and tomatoes that would feed their growing family through the coming year. The sight filled Emily with a contentment so profound it almost frightened her. After years of merely surviving, She was learning to trust in happiness again, to believe that good things could last. "Mama," Sarah called out, wiping dirt from her forehead and leaving a streak behind. "Look how straight we made this one." Emily walked over to admire their handiwork, noting the slight wobble in the board that Luke had diplomatically chosen not to correct. "It's perfect," she said, ruffling Sarah's hair. "The vegetables will love growing in such a well-made bed." Luke looked up at her with eyes that still held traces of wonder whenever he looked at her, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real and choosing to stay. The expression never failed to make her heart flutter. "We should have everything ready for planting by next week," he said, standing and brushing dirt from his knees. "That is, if my assistants here can stop getting more soil on themselves than in the beds." Margaret giggled, a sound that had become wonderfully common over the past months. "Sarah got dirt in her hair too," she pointed out with sisterly glee. "Did not?" Sarah protested, even as she unconsciously brushed at her tangled locks. Emily watched her daughters bicker with the easy affection of children who felt secure in their world. The transformation in both girls had been remarkable to witness. Sarah's natural boldness had returned in full force, no longer tempered by the need to protect her quieter sister. Margaret had blossomed as well, her shy intelligence finding expression in the questions she asked about everything from why plants grew toward the sun to how far away the mountains were. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention toward the main road. Emily felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that still accompanied unexpected visitors, though it was nothing like the paralyzing fear she had once known. Luke moved instinctively closer to her side, his presence a steady comfort. "It's all right," he murmured, squinting at the approaching riders. "I recognize them. It's Reverend Patterson and his wife, and looks like half the congregation from Mercy's Bend." Emily's anxiety shifted to puzzlement. What could they want? As the group drew nearer, Emily could see they were dressed in their Sunday best despite it being a Wednesday afternoon. Mrs. Patterson carried what appeared to be a large basket, while several other women bore covered dishes and bundles wrapped in bright cloth. Reverend Patterson, a kindly man in his 50s whose sermons were known more for their warmth than their fire, dismounted first and approached with a broad smile. "Luke, Emily," he called out cheerfully. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but we come bearing gifts and a proposition." "What kind of proposition?" Luke asked, though he was already moving to help the women down from their wagons. "Mrs." Patterson bustled forward, her round face beaming with excitement. "Well, it's come to our attention that while you two are living as man and wife in the eyes of the Lord and this community, you haven't had the benefit of a proper wedding ceremony." Emily felt her cheeks warm. She and Luke had spoken privately of marriage many times over the winter, but the formal ceremony had seemed less important than the commitment they had already made to each other. "We don't need," Emily began, but Mrs. Patterson waved her protest away. "Nonsense, child. Every woman deserves a proper wedding, and those beautiful daughters of yours deserve to see their mother married with all the joy and celebration such an occasion warrants. Besides," added Mrs. Murphy from the general store, "we've all seen how happy you've made each other. It's time the whole community had a chance to celebrate that happiness with you." Luke looked to Emily, his expression questioning. The decision, as always with him, was hers to make. Emily looked around at the assembled faces, people who had once whispered about her with suspicion but now regarded her with acceptance and warmth. Mrs. Henley, who had defended her against Tom Bradley's gossip. Young Doc Morrison, no relation to her late husband, who had treated Margaret's fever with gentle care when she'd fallen ill in February. The Carmichael family, whose ranch bordered Luke's and who had become trusted neighbors and friends. "What did you have in mind?" Emily asked, surprised by how much the idea appealed to her. Reverend Patterson's smile widened. "Nothing elaborate. Mind you, just a simple ceremony here on your property, with friends and neighbors to witness your vows. The ladies have brought food for a celebration afterward, and I believe young Tommy Brewster has his fiddle in the wagon." Sarah, who had been listening with growing excitement, suddenly clapped her hands together. A wedding! A real wedding with dancing? Margaret's eyes shone with quiet pleasure. Would you wear a white dress, Mama? Emily looked down at her work-worn brown skirt and laughed. I don't have a white dress, sweetheart. But I do, said a voice from behind the group. Emily turned to see Agnes Carmichael, the elderly woman who had spoken to her after the trial, approaching with a garment bag in her arms. I've been saving my wedding dress for 60 years, hoping one of my daughters might wear it, but they're all grown now, with daughters of their own, and none of them are quite your size. Agnes held up a dress of ivory silk, simple in design, but elegant, with tiny pearl buttons and delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. I altered it just a bit, she said with a shy smile. I hope you don't mind the presumption, but Martha Patterson told me what we were planning, and, well, every bride should have something special to wear. Emily felt tears prick her eyes as she reached out to touch the soft fabric. Mrs. Carmichael, I couldn't possibly— You can, and you will, the older woman said firmly. It would be my honor to see it worn by a woman as brave as you are. Luke stepped closer to Emily, his voice low and warm. What do you say? Shall we give these good people their wedding? Emily looked around again at the expectant faces, at her daughter's excited expressions, at Luke's patient smile. For so many years, she had lived in shadow, hiding from the judgment of others. But these people weren't here to judge. They were here to celebrate love and new beginnings. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger. Yes, I'd like that very much. The next hour passed in a whirlwind of preparation. The women shooed Emily into the cabin to prepare, while the men arranged benches borrowed from the church and strung lanterns from the trees. Someone had thought to bring wildflowers, and soon the entire area was decorated with bouquets of prairie roses, black-eyed Susans, and mountain lupine, misses. Patterson helped Emily into the wedding dress, which fit as if it had been made for her. Margaret brushed out her mother's hair and braided wildflowers into it, while Sarah insisted on picking out which of Emily's few pieces of jewelry she should wear. You look like a princess, Sarah declared when they were finished. A prairie princess, Margaret added with satisfaction. When Emily emerged from the cabin, the assembled guests fell silent. Luke, who had been adjusting his tie with nervous fingers, went completely still when he saw her. He had changed into his best suit, the one he'd worn to the trial, but someone had found him a white rose for his buttonhole, and his hair was neatly combed back. You're beautiful, he said simply when she reached his side, and the sincerity in his voice made her believe it. Reverend Patterson cleared his throat and began the simple ceremony. He spoke of love that endures through trials, of commitment that grows stronger in the face of adversity, of families built not just on blood, but on choice and dedication. When it came time for vows, Luke took Emily's hands in his and spoke from the heart. Emily, when you came to me through that storm, you brought more than shelter-seeking. You brought light back into my life. I promise to love you, protect you, and stand by you through whatever storms may come. I promise to be a father to Sarah and Margaret, to love them as my own and help them grow into the strong women their mother is raising them to be. Emily's voice trembled only slightly as she made her own promises. Luke, you showed me what love really means, not possession or control, but partnership and respect. You gave me safety when I had nowhere to turn, and hope when I thought it was lost forever. I promise to love you with all my heart, to build a life with you filled with joy and laughter, and to never forget that home is wherever we are together. When Reverend Patterson pronounced them husband and wife, Luke's kiss was gentle and reverent, mindful of their audience, but full of promise for the privacy they would share later. The celebration that followed was everything Emily could have hoped for and more. Tables groaned under the weight of contributed dishes, roast chicken, fresh bread, pies made with preserved berries, and a wedding cake that misses. Murphy had somehow managed to bake and transport without disaster. Tommy Brewster proved indeed to have his fiddle, and soon the evening was filled with music and dancing. Luke proved surprisingly graceful for such a large man. spinning Emily around the makeshift dance floor until she was breathless with laughter. Even the twins were included, with various men gallantly asking them to dance and teaching them simple steps. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emily found herself standing slightly apart from the festivities, watching her new husband dance with Margaret while Sarah clapped along to the music. The scene was so perfect, so far from anything she had ever dared dream, that she had to blink back tears of gratitude. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Agnes Carmichael appeared beside her, moving with the careful steps of advanced age. "I was just thinking how different my life is from what I expected it would be," Emily said softly. "A year ago, I thought happiness was something that happened to other people." Agnes nodded with understanding. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? The worst moments can lead to the best ones, if we're brave enough to keep moving forward. Were you happy? In your marriage? I mean," the older woman's face softened with memory. "Very happy. 63 years we had together before the Lord called him home. Not every day was easy, mind you, but we faced whatever came together. That's the secret. I think finding someone who will stand with you against whatever storms come." Emily watched Luke lift Margaret high in the air, spinning her until she squealed with delight. "I think I found that. I know you did, child. And he found it too. That man's been living half a life without even knowing it. You've made him whole." As the evening wound down and guests began to pack up their dishes and load their wagons, Emily felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of community support. People who had once viewed her with suspicion now embraced her as one of their own, wishing her joy and promising continued friendship. Finally, as the last wagon disappeared into the gathering dusk, Emily and Luke stood together on their porch, watching the twins chase fireflies in the growing darkness. "Mrs. Garrison," Luke said, trying out her new name with obvious pleasure. "Mr. Garrison," Emily replied, leaning against his solid warmth. "Any regrets about letting them railroad us into this wedding?" Emily considered the question seriously. "Only that we waited so long. This feels official now. Real in a way it didn't before." Luke's arm tightened around her waist. "It was always real to me. But I know what you mean. Having the community's blessing, seeing the girls so happy, it makes everything feel more solid somehow." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their daughters play, listening to the evening sounds of their land, cattle lowing in the distance, the soft whisper of wind through grass, the contented clucking of chickens settling for the night. "Luke," Emily said eventually, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found you that night? If the storm had driven me somewhere else?" "No," Luke said firmly. "I don't wonder about that because it didn't happen. You found me just like you were meant to. Everything that came before, all the pain and fear and uncertainty, it was just the path that led you home." Emily turned in his arms to look up at his face, seeing in his expression the same wonder and gratitude she felt in her own heart. "I love you, Luke Garrison. I love you too, Emily Garrison, forever and always." As if summoned by their parents' words, Sarah and Margaret came running up to the porch, their faces flushed with excitement and exertion. "Can we stay up late since it's your wedding day?" Sarah asked hopefully. "Just a little longer," Emily conceded, unable to deny them anything on this perfect day. The family settled together on the porch swing Luke had built over the winter. Emily and Luke in the center with the twins cuddled against their sides. Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called its haunting song. Emily closed her eyes and breathed deeply, committing every detail of the moment to memory. The warmth of Luke's hand in hers, the sweet weight of her daughters against her sides, the scent of prairie roses on the evening breeze, the sense of being exactly where she belonged. She had traveled so far from the frightened woman who had stumbled through a blizzard with 2 small children and a desperate hope for sanctuary. That woman could never have imagined this ending to her story. Love freely given and received. Children safe and thriving. A future bright with possibility. As the twins finally succumbed to sleep against their parents' sides and Luke carefully carried them inside to their beds, Emily lingered on the porch for one last look at their land. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There always were challenges in frontier life, but they would face them together, as a family, with love as their foundation and hope as their guide. The story that had begun with a desperate flight through winter darkness had transformed into something beautiful and lasting. And as Emily finally went inside to join her husband, she knew that the best chapters were still yet to be written. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this tale of love, redemption, and new beginnings in the Wild West. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story? Drop a comment below to let us know, and share your thoughts about Emily and Luke's journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of courage, love, and adventure from America's frontier days. Until next time, may your own trails lead to happiness and your campfires burn bright with hope.